People who knew murderers. When did you realize something was wrong? Story 1. I sat next to him in choir class, and there was always something a little off. He seemed to exist on his own wavelength, trapped in his own world, never really engaging with anyone. Other people didn't seem to register on his radar. During a class trip, we shared a hotel room, and he walked around naked as though I wasn't even there. At the time, I assumed he might be autistic, but looking back, it could have been something more serious, perhaps schizophrenia. He never seemed violent, but no one really spoke to him long enough to know for sure. A few months ago, he brutally beat and stabbed his mother to death with a kitchen knife. The attack was so vicious that her body had to be identified through dental records. He cut off one of her breasts and, in his confession, implied that he had eaten part of it. Afterward, he waited for his father to come home from work so he could show him what he had done. He claimed the devil had sent him a sign telling him to kill her, though that may have been an excuse. From what I heard, he was disturbingly eager to tell the police about his actions, possibly because he wanted the attention. He turned himself in, waived his Miranda rights, and confessed in full. When the police found him, he was literally soaked in blood and refused to shower. They had to hose him down before putting him in a cell. He is now facing 40 years in prison. His mother was an incredible woman. She tailored suits for our choir, volunteered constantly, and was preparing to run for town council the following year. She adored her son. She never deserved such a fate. Story 2, I didn't know him personally, just as a regular customer at my shop. He often stopped by after his shift to buy beer and tobacco. Once he even helped us catch a shoplifter, and he seemed friendly enough. Then, a local girl went missing. Weeks later, her body was pulled from a river. When police announced they were looking for someone in connection with her death, it turned out to be him. CCTV footage showed him tailing her through a park and later buying beer at a shop. The store's background was blurred in the footage, so it's unclear if it was ours. Since we had the news playing on TV at work, my staff and I started discussing whether we had seen him that day. We hadn't. But then one of my employees, a young woman, admitted something chilling. She had already told management she disliked closing shifts because of creepy men. She said this customer used to stare at her in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable, to the point she avoided the shop floor when he came in. Police never got to question him about the murder. He was found dead in a local park a few days later, having hanged himself. Story 3. I went through primary and high school with a boy a year younger than me. He lived nearby, and we caught the bus from the same stop. He was a bit of a bully, but not the kind who lashed out because of pain or insecurity. He seemed to hurt people simply because he wanted to, without realizing or caring that it caused harm. He was the type of kid who might pull wings off flies for fun. Not long after I left town, I learned he had been charged with murdering a 2-year-old girl. His girlfriend left her daughter in his care for just an hour while she ran an errand. He couldn't tolerate the child's crying, so he beat her, causing internal bleeding that killed her in the hospital. He was about 22 at the time. In 2014 in Australia, he was sentenced to 36 years with a non-parole period of 27. Looking back, the biggest red flag was clear. People who hurt others, or animals, because it gives them pleasure, are the most frightening. Once the brain links cruelty with dopamine release, how do you stop it? He clearly had deep psychological issues. And while 36 years in prison may not fix him, I can only hope some kind of rehabilitation or treatment will help. Story 4. Knew a guy, let's call him Steve, who murdered a nurse. He had ordered a murder kit online and stabbed her over 50 times. His goal was to become the town's first serial killer. I knew him through scouts. Our troop was laid back. We didn't focus on badges. Our leaders were easygoing guys, and most of our time was spent on silly games like crab football or building catapults to fire things across the hall. We were misfits, but Steve was different, truly unsettling. His behavior first stood out when he kept pulling his pants down and dancing around, showing his bare backside. At first, it was shocking and maybe even a little funny, but when he wouldn't stop, even after repeated warnings, it went from annoying to boring to just plain creepy. Nobody wanted to see it, but he wouldn't quit. He also brought in printed out, disturbing adult content to try and gross people out. The troop leaders confiscated it, but he kept pushing boundaries. Sometimes he was suspended for a week, but he was never expelled. He seemed childish in some ways, but also unsettlingly creepy. When I later learned he had committed murder, I was shocked, but not surprised. Then I remembered all those times we had played hide-and-seek in the dark with him, in a hall that had a kitchen full of knives. That memory still unsettles me. Story 5. When I was 19, I moved to a new town and made friends at work. One girl invited me to hang out with her and her best friend. The best friend's boyfriend was there, and immediately the vibes were wrong. He was cold, angry for no apparent reason, and just controlling. I had already been told he hit her, but what I saw was beyond controlling. It was dangerous. One day she came home to find him digging a hole in the backyard. When she asked what he was doing, he told her, "Digging your grave." He told her that if he couldn't have her, no one could. She eventually left him and got a restraining order, but somehow he persuaded her to get into a car with him during her work break. She went missing for several days. It turned out he had stabbed her, thrown her body into a river, and then taken his own life. I had only met her a few times, and him just once, but knowing I was so close to someone capable of such evil still gives me chills. She was young. She didn't deserve that. Story 6. When I was a teenager, a family lived around the corner. Mother, stepfather, and son. My own mother knew them better than I did, and they always seemed like a lovely family. But a few years ago, the son started going to the hospital saying voices in his head were telling him to kill his stepfather. Each time he was released and told to return later, given appointments weeks away. Eventually, during a small argument, he stabbed his stepfather to death in their garden. The next day, he turned himself in, because he had repeatedly sought help. Beforehand, he wasn't convicted in the traditional sense. He was committed for psychiatric treatment instead. Some people speculated he used mental illness as a defense, but those who knew the family said otherwise. The way he turned himself in, and how broken he seemed afterward, suggested it was genuine. It's horrifying to imagine being trapped in your own mind, aware that you might kill someone, begging for help, but being turned away until it was too late. He now has to live with not only the guilt, but also the mental torment of those voices. They never fought. Instead, they always seemed to carry the weight of mourning. A few years later, I heard that the mother had left the father, and, in response, he killed the entire family before taking his own life. Another co-worker went down a similar path. He lived with his elderly father, and although he was genuinely kind, there was always a heavy sadness behind his smile. When his girlfriend broke up with him and his father's health declined, the pressure became unbearable. He shot his father, and then himself. Even after learning what he did, I couldn't help but feel pity. He had such a big heart. If he'd only had someone to talk to or a single day to breathe, I truly believe things could have turned out differently. Story 8. My uncle is serving life in prison for murder. From my earliest memories, I knew something wasn't right with him. He caught his wife at her lover's house and shot the man. He was about to kill his wife too, but she convinced him to spare her, promising she wouldn't tell anyone. He burned down the victim's house to cover his tracks, but as soon as his wife was free, she reported him. I always got creepy vibes from him. He reminded me of a poor man's Charles Manson. Story 9. One of my ex-co-workers was a massive jerk that nobody liked working with. He was always glued to his phone, even when customers were waiting in the drive-thru. The first moment I realized something was off was when I caught him digging through lockers in the back room. He normally used a top locker, but that day he was rifling through the bottom one, which happened to be mine. I told him, and he just stared blankly at me for a moment before walking away. Later that same year, I found out he had shot and killed someone at a gas station. Looking back, he was probably trying to steal from me, and the way he lied on the spot, combined with that unsettling stare, still creeps me out. Story 10. I never suspected a thing. She was the sweetest woman, so much so that I even let her babysit my cousin when I had custody of him. She was my neighbor a few houses down, and everyone adored her. She grew massive pumpkins, always worked outside, and regularly chatted with people in the neighborhood. Years later, after I moved away, I was shocked to hear what happened. She had been married, but one day her husband suddenly disappeared. She showed up beaten and bruised, claiming he had attacked her. People suspected he'd left her for another woman in a nearby town. We never heard from him again, but she occasionally mentioned that he still harassed her, even saying she'd been beaten again after his disappearance. Since he was self-employed and had little family, no one questioned it. 3 years later, while dating another man, she came under investigation for stealing from the grocery store where she worked. Police went to her boyfriend's cabin to arrest her. She answered the door, told them she needed to put on clothes, and shut the door. Moments later, they heard 2 gunshots. When they rushed inside, she had set the cabin on fire, shot her dog, and then turned the gun on herself. After the fire was extinguished, investigators found her boyfriend's body in the basement. He hadn't died in the blaze. He'd been killed days earlier. Digging deeper, they discovered a blue 55-gallon drum buried in her yard containing her missing husband. In the end, she had murdered 2 men and her dog. Yet until then, the only suspicion against her had been petty theft. Story 11. The murderer I knew was more of a casual acquaintance. He lived down the hall, and while we hung out in groups, it was never just the 2 of us. One day, I passed him in the stairwell, said hello, and he greeted me back. Only he called me by the wrong name. He avoided eye contact, seemed distracted, and walked off quickly. I brushed it off, thinking maybe we weren't as close as I believed. Later, he was at my apartment playing N64 with my roommate. He apologized, saying his mind was elsewhere. A few days later, the building was swarming with police. His roommate had been found shot in the back of the head and dumped in a vacant lot across town. The next day, he confessed. So apparently, if someone calls me by the wrong name, they're a murderer. Good to know. Thanks, OP. Story 12. There was a kid from high school who always made me uneasy. We had mutual friends, so I often ended up around him, though he gave me chills. In senior year, he was suspended after someone turned in a hit list he'd written. Nobody took it too seriously at the time. 3 years after graduation, he made the news for killing a man in our town, someone he barely even knew. When questioned, he told police he had held the man's eyes open so he could watch the life leave his body. Story 13. I never saw it coming. He was the sweetest, most gentle giant of a man. A little odd, sure, but overall kind-hearted. I remember him tearing up just talking about his child, overwhelmed with love. Yet this same man murdered his wife, kidnapped his child, triggered the longest Amber Alert in Canadian history, and killed another man to steal his car while fleeing across provinces. Even now, I wonder if I missed warning signs, and the thought still haunts my nightmares. Story 14. Looking back, I should have noticed immediately, but at the time I didn't recognize what I was seeing. In 2016, I was working as a server. One of my coworkers frequently complained about her husband, loud, argumentative, and aggressive, but I dismissed it as typical fighting. One evening, the 2 of them came in for dinner and sat in my section. I was curious to finally put a face to the name. Yet every time I approached their table, I felt physically uncomfortable. I couldn't meet his eyes, and just being near him made my skin crawl. Not long after, my coworker stopped showing up for work. A few weeks later, the news broke. She had been murdered by him. From that day on, I never dismissed domestic disputes so lightly again. Story 15. I grew up with this kid. We were friends through elementary and middle school, though not especially close. He was the stereotypical Southern redneck, kind, but not the sharpest. Eventually, we drifted apart. A year after graduation, in the same small town we'd grown up in, he killed his entire family. His mother, father, brother, and stepsister. There was no provocation, no clear motive. Afterward, he went ATV riding with friends as though nothing had happened. He was eventually caught, but in court he claimed to have no memory of the murders. He sat through his trial stone-faced, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of it all. I didn't feel sympathy for him, but I felt something, maybe sadness. Seeing someone I knew, who once seemed so harmless, commit such atrocities was unsettling. Story 16. This one is less about murder and more about something equally disturbing. Around 5 years ago, my mom hired a contractor named Andrew to remodel her kitchen. He showed up with his 11-year-old daughter to help. The moment I saw them, I got an eerie feeling, like he might be abusing her. I had no proof, but his vibe was deeply unsettling. Every day for 2 weeks, he brought her along. She acted cheerful enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I asked my mom daily when he'd finish because I didn't want him in the house. She brushed me off, saying he was nice and did good work. A year later, my mom called me. "Remember Andrew?" she asked. "He got caught abusing his daughter." But it was even worse. He had been torturing his entire family, forcing his son to eat his own feces, abusing his daughters, all under the guise of religion. His family eventually fled in the middle of the night, and he was sentenced to life in prison. When people talk about bad vibes, I wonder if it's our subconscious, picking up on subtle cues, or if some people really do radiate evil. Story 17. My biological father murdered my stepmom. Everyone in my family, my mom, my 2 older brothers, and I, knew he was dangerous. He had severe anger issues and was extremely abusive. Some of my earliest memories involve him choking my brothers, and he nearly strangled my mother to death, more than once. Thankfully, she divorced him before it was too late. Years later, I came home from school to learn that he had shot and killed my stepmom. None of us were shocked. If anything, I was simply grateful that my mother had escaped him when she did. It's still unsettling knowing that my own father is a murderer. Pregnant at 15 by my grandfather, I had to get married in the 1960s. He was extremely abusive, and my grandmother went to the police multiple times because she feared he would eventually end someone's life. They didn't take her seriously and ignored her. A couple of years later, he strangled and beat a 14-year-old girl to death with a baseball bat. Story 19. The first time I met him, Jose, he was a friend of my ex, and something immediately seemed off. He was sneaky, always lying and cheating, though not very good at it because he was dumb and a total narcissist as well. I told my ex to keep his distance because Jose would only drag him into trouble. Sure enough, Jose not only set up my ex to be robbed, but he also snitched on a bunch of people. Eventually, he snapped in a fit of road rage and stabbed a stranger to death. The guy he murdered was young, a good kid, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I hope that jerk rots in prison. Story 20. I know one and still keep in contact with him. We all knew he had issues with rage, but we never thought he would actually murder someone. We worked together at a restaurant and got close. Close enough that if I hadn't been in a committed relationship, I would have dated him. He was super chill, down to earth, and one of the sweetest people until something triggered him. He didn't get angry often, but when he did, it was explosive. He had been horribly abused by his father as a child, so he carried deep resentment toward men who looked or acted like his dad. That's where we bonded. because I had been abused by my mother. Thankfully, I had resources to manage my trauma. Unfortunately, he did not. His parents believed God would cure him. His mother eventually left because his father would pull him out of therapy whenever progress was being made. She couldn't handle it anymore. About 6 months after I met him, he suffered a concussion while helping a friend move. A dresser fell on his head. After that, he was never the same. He quit showing up to work, went almost completely silent, and although we still talked, we weren't as close. I moved into the city while he stayed in the suburbs, and we planned to meet up to catch up. But a week later, I got a call from a friend at 7 a.m. telling me he was in jail for hiding a body. Was shocked. During the investigation, he confessed quickly he had beaten his father to death with a barbell and tried to hide the body in the house. He later attempted to take his own life, but failed. After he was booked, I sent him a letter to check in. He told me he had suffered a psychotic episode and only remembers fragments of what happened. Now he's serving 40 years, with the possibility of parole after 20. Last I checked, he was medicated, doing well, involved in activities, and working through his trauma with a psychiatrist. Story 21. My ex and I were middle school sweethearts who stayed together into high school. He was sweet and good to me. We drifted apart but remained friends. About a year later, while drinking, his best friend made a comment about finding me attractive. That led to my ex attempting to poison him with rat poison. He was jailed as a juvenile, but got out. When he came back, he had anger issues, and eventually, we all went our separate ways. He later moved to Florida. The next thing we heard, he was in jail for murder. Like many bad Florida stories, drugs were involved. Hooked. On ice, he met a girl, and in their desperation to keep their habit going, they targeted an elderly couple. They broke into their home, tied them up, and ransacked the place. The couple gave them PIN numbers and anything else of value. But in their drugged-up state, my ex and his girlfriend decided the couple had seen too much. They dug a huge hole, buried the couple alive, and then used their ATM card to withdraw $200. That's all. That's how they were caught. He's now on death row for 2 counts of murder, along with kidnapping and robbery. And that, folks, is the story of my ex, the double murderer. Story 22. There was a kid I went to school with from 5th to 8th grade. He was always a jerk, your typical class clown with a mean streak. In middle school, he constantly made inappropriate comments toward girls. I hated being around him. Later, he got into ice and, while high, shot his mom and dad in their sleep. His mom died. His dad survived but was severely injured. Last I heard, he was crying crocodile tears, claiming he regretted everything and wanted another chance. Knowing him, it's total BS. He deserves to rot. Story 23. I've worked with 3 murderers in my job supporting people with disabilities. All 3 had different levels of learning disability, and honestly, I only suspected something was off with one of them. He worked out a plea deal because his disability suggested he lacked mens rea and fitness to plead. One day after the investigation was over, I was driving him home when he turned to me and said, "Don't tell my wife about this." That was the exact moment I knew he was fully aware of what he had done. The other 2 cases were different. One woman was so traumatized by what she had done that she never recovered. She spent 25 years in prison and came out completely broken. The last case involved a couple. Another vulnerable adult went missing, and this couple even joined search teams and appeared devastated, crying on TV and begging for her return. But she had been under their bed the whole time. Story 24. 2 scenarios stand out. First, I went to high school with the girl who later became infamous in the U.S. for convincing her boyfriend to take his own life. Afterward, she ran charity events for him before eventually being caught. The text messages became public record, and they were chilling. I think she got manslaughter, but her case went to appeal and may even reach the Supreme Court. In high school, she was completely forgettable. Nothing remarkable. Second, while in college, I worked summers at a bookstore. One coworker was decent but odd. He'd make inappropriate comments about students, but seemed harmless. Years later, he was charged with attempted murder after stabbing his wife multiple times. An affair was reportedly involved. She only survived because a construction worker saw the attack and intervened. Shout out to that guy for his courage. Story 25. This one may not technically count, but it's worth telling. My partner and I had neighbors across the street, a couple in their 30s. The husband came over almost daily to chat with my partner. He would talk about being assaulted by his brother as a kid and how nobody cared. The wife was strange. She sat on the porch all day, silent, doing nothing. All I knew was that she didn't have custody of her kids. A few months later, our street filled with cop cars and ambulances. We watched as police busted down their door, tampered with their lawnmower, and eventually carried out 2 body bags. It turned out they had taken their own lives, or one killed them both by consent. They ran a lawnmower inside the house and the fumes killed them. Their dog died too. We felt terrible for them, especially when the landlord dumped their belongings on the street the next day. Only one person came to grieve. We were also angry at them for killing their dog. Months later, I saw a Reddit video of a man beating up a registered offender. Curious, I searched Family Watchdog, and there she was, the wife. Her last name was different, so I Googled it. I found her obituary and a news article revealing that she and her ex-husband had assaulted all 3 of their children. She only served 4 years in jail. Her ex is still out there. After learning that, we didn't feel as bad for them anymore. That was a real emotional roller coaster. Story 26. In my early 20s in India, I knew someone who was a dirtbag but fun under the right circumstances. I kept things pleasant but always at arm's length. Years later, my mom told me he and his 4 brothers were hired killers. Apparently, 2 men fought over property, and one hired them. They waited until the victim got home, changed clothes, and relaxed. Then they exploded an oil can outside his house. When he rushed out, they threw red chili powder in his eyes to blind him, then hacked him to pieces with sickles. At the funeral, the body was in multiple parts. I knew the victim, too. He had 2 daughters. Freaking crazy. I guess I was right to keep my distance. Still, whether a murderer is hired or does it for sport, I wouldn't want to interact with either. Story 27. It was my brother. He died when I was 13 and he was 18, but I knew he was capable long before that, since I was 6 and he was 11. He used to play death games. He would sit on my chest, pin my arms with his knees, and suffocate me until I would pass out, and he'd wake me just to do it again. Some days this went on for over an hour, on top of every other kind of abuse you could imagine. For a year straight, I was assaulted, beaten, and suffocated regularly. Once, he forced me to stand in front of him while he punched me in the groin again and again. He claimed he was making me a man and wouldn't stop until I no longer flinched from the pain. I couldn't tell anyone what was happening. I was more afraid of him than I was confident my parents could help or even believe me. At the time, he was my main babysitter. After that year, he finally moved out. My mom worked nights, and my stepdad was a truck driver. One night, my brother decided to feed me garbage. He cracked an egg onto a plate, added coffee grounds and trash from the garbage can, and demanded I eat it. When I refused, he sprinkled salt and pepper on top and said, "There, now it's more appetizing." That disgusting plate was still sitting there when my mom came home. She was furious and told us that if we couldn't keep the house clean, then neither of us would be allowed to eat her food. My brother snapped at this and moved in with another family. For a short while, I was free, though I lived off only school lunches for 2 days, until my uncle found out and stepped in to stop it. From age 12 to 18, my brother spiraled into constant trouble. He was arrested multiple times for assault and was shuffled through alternative programs like Outward Bound and boot camp. At 17, he was sentenced to 2 years in juvenile detention. He served a year before being placed with a preacher in a nearby town, who convinced the parole board that my brother was rehabilitated. Against objections from local police, they released him from all supervision. That preacher introduced him to new friends, one of whom he later moved in with. He also met a girl just before summer and quickly fell in love. It turned out to be nothing more than a summer fling. When she broke up with him, partly because of his controlling, abusive behavior, he snapped. One weekend, he came back home to see friends and also stopped by to visit us. My mom later said she had a bad feeling about him, but of course, that's just hindsight. Sunday night, he returned to where he was living. On Monday night, he executed his 3 roommates with a gun stolen from a friend who had burglarized a local hardware store. He also stole one of the victim's cars and drove 8 hours to his ex-girlfriend's college. Early Tuesday morning, he somehow entered her dorm. He shot her in the foot, threatened to kill her, and locked her and several dorm mates inside a room. This turned into a 6-hour standoff with police. Eventually, he leaned out the window one too many times, and a sniper shot him in the neck. Even then, as police stormed the room, he tried firing back, but he was already dying. He passed away later in the hospital. For a short time, my family became national news. When did I know? I knew at 6 years old, when the abuse first began. I thought I would be his first victim. The day he died was the first day of my real life, a day without terror. Honestly, being horrifically abused for years is a clear sign that someone like him would end up doing something terrible. And to the OP, I am truly sorry you endured this. No child deserves to grow up in fear, and the fact that nobody could intervene despite all the warning signs is heartbreaking. Story 28. I had a friend who stopped taking his medication. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. I can't remember which. He ended up stabbing his mother and younger sister to death, then drank their blood. After his arrest, authorities found him consuming his own waste and rambling about how menstrual blood sustained him. Once medicated again, the state deemed him mentally competent to stand trial, and he was convicted. I don't remember his sentence at the time, but later I looked it up. He was given 80 years. He used a carving knife and fork during the murders, and his sister was only 6. Story 29. Unfortunately, I know several people who have committed murder. The one I recognized as off from an early age was a guy everyone in the neighborhood called Biggie. He always seemed unhinged. He claimed he had fought in the jungles of Vietnam, though he was only 2 years old when the war ended. About 5 years ago, he was incarcerated for killing dogs. During a day pass, he didn't return. Instead, he beat a well-known gay activist to death at a bar. He's since been released and now lives with his parents. I honestly believe he'll do it again, though to be clear, I hope I'm wrong. Story 30. There was a man who stabbed a young brunette woman 37 times and then assaulted her corpse. It went cold for 9 years until police finally caught him. The crazy part? I was also a young brunette woman who worked next door to the bar he frequented. I was a heavy drinker then, often blacking out and walking home at night. I never spoke to him, though I spoke to everyone else. Something about him put me on edge. I never trusted him enough to even turn my back. When his arrest finally came, thanks to a relative's DNA in a genealogy database, I got chills. I wasn't surprised, just eerily validated. I've been sober almost 2 years now, and I thank God for that. Story 31. My neighbor and my first sort of boyfriend killed his girlfriend's mother after stealing money for drugs. He had always been controlling, but once he started using hard drugs at 17, he became a real danger. After running away from home, his mom later received the call that he'd been arrested for murder. I think it was reduced to manslaughter because there wasn't enough evidence of intent. Story 32. A kid at my high school murdered his grandmother before class one morning. I didn't know him well. We weren't in the same grade or friend groups. But I worked in the library during lunch and I'd see him often. He was quiet, but sometimes had sudden, strange outbursts. Never full-on meltdowns, but flashes of anger over seemingly nothing. Sometimes he sat with a book, sometimes with nothing at all. One morning, he killed his grandmother with a lamp because she caught him sleeping in. It was devastating, especially since our school was academically selective. He must have been book smart, but it didn't save him from whatever darkness he was in. Story 33. There was this kid I went to school with from 7th through 12th grade. He was always a jerk, yelling in class, acting out, constantly disruptive. One day after school, I was giving my gay friend a ride. While parked, the troublemaker banged on my window. Thinking he needed something, my friend cracked the window, only for the kid to look at him with pure hatred and spit out a slur. He then walked away like nothing happened. That moment shook us both. Years later, I learned he murdered his own mother in cold blood. Looking back, that serious, hateful expression he gave my friend must have been the truest glimpse of who he really was. Story 34. One of my childhood friends was the son of a wealthy family. He was generous, always inviting us to his amazing game room to play Warhammer, buying extra sets so we could all join in. Right after high school, he had a house where we all hung out for movie nights and video games, gladly sharing the spare. Bedrooms he let us crash in whenever we needed a place to stay. Today he's serving 300 years for 4 counts of assault and a murder. Apparently he killed a girl during an extreme breath play incident, and when she passed out, he prioritized his own needs over calling an ambulance. None of us had any idea he was capable of something like that, and it really shook me up. Just knowing how much time I spent with him, how often he bought me great things that defined my high school years, unsettles me. I still have the Warhammer figures he gave me tucked away in a closet. Sometimes I'm tempted to throw them out to erase him from my life completely. But at the same time, those figures also carry memories of endless summer afternoons spent with friends, painting miniatures, and tearing up the tabletop together. When I look at them, I don't see the man who bought the box. I see my friends and the joy we shared. Story 35. I played Dungeons & Dragons with a guy during deployment in the Navy. We hung out in the same group for a few months, but I eventually stopped playing because he constantly tried to assault female NPCs and player characters. When deployment ended, the FBI and NCIS were waiting at the pier for him. Turned out he and some others had assaulted and murdered a woman whose husband was deployed. I also had friends as a teenager who tied up an old man they suspected of touching someone's younger brother. They tortured him for hours, murdered him, and tried to burn his body. 2 of them got life sentences. The third turned state's evidence and only served a few years. Another friend of mine got arrested by the ATF for trying to blow up the car of our local ADA. He had bought fake C4 from an undercover agent, and they swarmed him while he tried to detonate it. Writing all of this makes me realize I've been close to some really messed up people. Maybe I'm the one who isn't right. Story 36. I knew Esteban Santiago, not personally, but I worked at the hostel where he stayed before flying to Florida. He was quiet, reserved, and often talked to himself. But he didn't seem dangerous, even compared to the rest of the misfits we housed at the Coop Kiak. I was working the night he carried a small Pelican gun case into a cab and left for the airport. He barely looked up, just nodded at the ground as he left. The next day, after his face was on the news, the FBI shut the hostel down and dug through dumpsters for evidence. Strange as it sounds, I would have bet money that 2 other regulars were more likely to go on a killing spree. One of them had been arrested for stabbing someone, and even threatened to stab me when I told him not to threaten guests. The other was a man who worked the slopes, had no friends, no acquaintances, and no family alive. At first, I thought he was mute. Took me a week to realize he just didn't talk. I thought I understood what a loner was before I met him. Story 37. A few years ago, I knew a guy who was basically the walking version of I am very badass. His social media was endless selfies. Him with knives, with guns, daring someone to try him. Others were shirtless bathroom shots showing off his satanic tattoos. Unlike the ironic kind of Satanists, he believed the Bible was real, but chose to worship Satan instead. He was a violent drunk who hated women, yet somehow always had girlfriends. What struck me was how every time he started dating someone new, his exes would warn her to stay away. With his last girlfriend, things played out the same. She eventually called the police, reporting that he had gotten drunk and slammed her into a wall. While she was still on the phone, he went to grab his gun. The 911 recording ends with her saying, "He's coming back now," followed by a scream. They later found her body in the neighbor's yard and his in the doorway. Story 38. I grew up around a friend's family, and at first everything seemed normal. But even as a teenager, I sensed something wrong with his dad. Before a school dance, the father asked his son for a kiss, then bit him so hard he bled. Shocking, yes, but not unexpected, because he often did disturbing things in front of us. His second wife, who once babysat me and my brother on base, fled in the middle of the night with her 2 babies, leaving behind her older kids from another marriage. Later, when my own mother escaped an abusive relationship, we were dirt poor. The same man tried to bribe her with a contract proposing marriage, claiming they wouldn't have to sleep together until she learned to love him. He even gave me and my brother the best Christmas of our lives to sweeten the deal. Thankfully, she refused. Years later, my best friend dated his younger son, while I dated the older after he was dishonorably discharged from the military. Eventually, all 4 of us moved to Florida. That's when I noticed how they isolated us, turning us against friends and family, making everything a family secret. When my best friend and I had enough, we ran away. They caught us in Tennessee, followed us back to St. Louis, and only left once we were home. While we were gone, the dad remarried and had another child. Later, I learned he manipulated his abused sons into helping him murder his wife, staging it as a drowning at the Lake of the Ozarks. I attended her funeral with my mother, and we both silently knew she'd been killed. Eventually, the son I once dated confessed out of guilt. Abusers manipulate slowly, so you never realize the full extent of their control until it's too late. Those boys committed horrific acts, but their lives had been shaped by abuse from birth. Breaking that cycle is nearly impossible when the abuser is your father. Story 39. I was friends with a guy in high school who eventually murdered another friend of mine. When his name came up as a suspect, I remembered all our late-night talks about true crime, the Zodiac killer, and even joking conversations about how we'd dispose of a body. Since I grew up with a mother obsessed with true crime, none of it seemed strange at the time. He liked true crime, like me, except he eventually took it further, becoming a reenactor. Story 40. There was a boy I went to grade school with who constantly wet himself. He always wanted to hang around me. Our mothers worked together as housekeepers at a nearby resort, and when they couldn't find childcare during vacations, they brought us along. While there, he sometimes went through 3 or 4 pairs of pants in a single day. I also ended up with him in my summer rec program group, where he once ran around fully clothed he used to jump into the pool when it wasn't our turn, always pretending it was an accident, but I knew he was just covering up the fact that he had wet himself on the playground. Sometimes he'd sneak up onto the hill behind the school, lay out in the sun with his legs spread, and hope he'd dry off before recess ended. I felt sorry for him. I had a neuresis at night until I was 14, so I kind of understood. Still, his condition affected his social life much more than mine. Eventually, he turned into a bully. On the playground or in gym class, if someone beat him fairly, he'd explode, cursing at them, trying to start fights, then he moved away. About 10 years later, I read in the newspaper that he had murdered his girlfriend while she was asleep. She had a little daughter who was only 1 or 2 years old at the time. A few years after that, I came across an article about the link between enuresis and homicide. Apparently, studies showed it was one of 3 major warning signs of future violent behavior. The theory was that it pointed to underdeveloped growth of the amygdala, the part of the brain that influences bladder control, emotional learning, fear response, and sensitivity to external stimuli. Out of curiosity, I looked him up recently. He was no longer in prison. He had taken his own life. Story 41. A friend of my mother's once stabbed his boyfriend to death, the boyfriend being one of her closest friends. He even called my mom, right after the murder, asking if he could come over and take a shower. She realized something was seriously wrong in that moment. Before then, I actually liked him. Later, my mom told me he had made inappropriate comments about my brother and me back in high school, which is why she never invited him to the house. That was probably when she first sensed something was off. Story 42. A girl I used to work with about 10 years ago was murdered by her ex-boyfriend. He tied her up to stage it as a suicide, but the autopsy revealed she had died before being hung. As her parents pointed out, dead people don't hang themselves. She had no history of suicidal thoughts. She was happy, full of plans, finishing her degree, dating again, and had just bought a new car and house. Still, the police shrugged it off, small-town style, as if nothing had happened. Her ex had always been abusive, narcissistic, controlling, and violent. She often showed up with bruises and scratches from his outbursts. He sent her death threats at work, harassed her co-workers, and even threatened her family and friends. Just a week before her death, he broke into her home and nearly strangled her to death. So it was no surprise when he eventually killed her. Years later, he started dating another one of my co-workers. Those of us who had known his first girlfriend constantly warned her, but she insisted, "He's changed." At first, he seemed great. Then one night, he chased her and their 2 kids into the bathroom with a knife, barricaded them inside, and set the trailer on fire. Thankfully, the neighbors had called the police after hearing the yelling and threats, so she and the children managed to escape. The trailer burned down completely. They bizarrely stayed together for a while and even had another child, but I don't think they're together anymore. Story 43. I survived an attempted family annihilation. I disliked my stepfather from the moment I met him. Every time he was around, I felt constant dread. My stomach knotted, my chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. His pale blue eyes looked like those of a predator, empty, cold, animalistic. But I never told my mom. I wanted her to be happy and feared she'd dismiss me as being dramatic. Shortly after he moved in, he began beating us. My mom married him in May 1996. Less than 2 years later, in January 1998, he murdered her and tried to kill me. He's still in prison. His last parole hearing was in 2012, when the board was evenly split on whether to release him. I'm fairly certain he'll get out next time he's up, in 2022. Story 44. My father grew up in a small Indian village. When he was 7, a feud broke out between 2 families over farming land. 2 brothers from one family armed themselves with swords to attack the other. But the opposing family brought guns. In broad daylight, in the middle of the village, the brothers were gunned down. My dad witnessed the entire thing. He later explained that both families were so prideful that a violent confrontation was inevitable. Ironically, those 2 brothers were somehow related to me. Story 45. When I was 13, I had a friend whose older brother, around 19, was feared and respected for his gangster lifestyle. He was polite to everyone, except my own older brother, who had fought with him repeatedly. My brother knew something dark lingered inside him and refused to trust him, even though avoiding him ruined his social life. He understood that keeping his distance was worth more than popularity. Nearly 20 years later, I was at a friend's house buying weed. A huge, steroid-fueled guy was there, rambling about silencing witnesses. He described how he and a friend had hidden inside a person's closet, waiting for them to fall asleep so they could terrorize and threaten them into silence. When he finally said his name, my heart stopped. It was my friend's older brother. I discreetly texted a friend in the room, warning him not to say my last name in front of the guy. It might set him off. The whole time, adrenaline flooded my body. My fight-or-flight response went into overdrive. I was mentally preparing to jump out of a second-story window onto the concrete below if it meant escaping. A couple of years later, news broke that he had been convicted of murder. He had stuffed his victim into a barrel and left it in a creek. Story 46. He was the son of one of my dad's co-workers before my father was laid off. Since the men had worked together for 32 years, I occasionally saw him growing up. He was my age and went to the same schools, but he clearly had impulse control issues. Once on the way to middle school, he spotted a baseball bat on a lawn and smashed the windshield of a nearby car with it. He was also obsessed with death and often talked about wanting to see someone die. Naturally, I avoided him, though my best friend tried to be kind and talk to him before classes. One day, she was called into the principal's office. He had written a list of people not to kill in a fantasy school shooting, and she was on it. After that, he vanished for a while, and I didn't see him again until high school. Years later, after graduation, I was working a part-time job downtown making food runs. Local restaurants displayed flyers for a missing boy our age who was mentally handicapped. His family feared he had wandered into the desert. A few weeks later, I saw my old classmate's mugshot on the news. He had murdered the missing boy. He and his friends had lured the kid into the desert. Then he shot him with a crossbow and slit his throat. Story 47. My ex-boyfriend's descent into madness was gradual. At first, he seemed normal, maybe a little narcissistic, always bragging about his confidence and ability to read people. He often claimed he knew the future. Once, he told me I would always be his. I laughed and asked, "What if we break up, I marry someone else and have kids?" His reply, "Doesn't matter. You and that child will still be mine." At first, I brushed it off as a creepy attempt at romance, but when we eventually broke up, I moved far away and got married. His sister later told me that he kept saying I would be his no matter what. Deep down, I believed him. My instincts warned me he could kill me. Years passed, and I transitioned after realizing I was transgender. With hormone therapy and support, I finally felt safe. When word spread about my transition, his obsession seemed to fade, which was a huge relief. Then, in 2018, I got a call from an old mutual friend. My ex had made the news. He had been working at an airport and repeatedly harassed a woman who already had a fiancé and child. After she rejected him too many times, he waited outside her home. When her fiancé arrived, my ex ran up to the driver's side window and shot him dead. He was caught quickly, but the damage was done. That poor woman lost the love of her life and the father of her child, all because of his delusional belief that killing her fiancé would make her fall into his arms. Truth is, you can't rationalize the mind of someone like that. Delusions are called delusions for a reason. They aren't grounded in reality, and more often than not, they're fueled by severe mental illness. Things like this are sometimes treatable with medication or professional help. I'm not excusing. What this guy did, it was horrific, but it seems that in his mind, the world just didn't look the way it does to the rest of us. Story 48, it's actually fascinating to reflect on. He had a relationship with a vulnerable friend, and he was controlling, impulsive, and irrational. To most people, though, he just looked like your typical insecure guy who found someone even more insecure to dominate. Thankfully, we encouraged her to leave him, which she eventually did. Soon after, the news broke about the body-in-the-barrel murder. Within a few days, his own body was found. Before killing himself, he had murdered his former boss. Looking back, the lesson is clear. Control was everything to him. If he didn't get his way, he would throw tantrums like a 20-something child and never compromise. Story 49I once knew a forensic psychiatrist, an incredibly sharp and funny man, even in his late 80s when he was still serving as an expert witness. But some of the things he said were chilling. The scariest? The only difference between you and a murderer is that one day they stop ignoring the dark thoughts that most of us push aside. And maybe one day, when you're angry enough, you won't ignore them either. He admitted some people truly lack empathy or compassion, but he said those cases are rare. In his view, most killers are just ordinary people pushed past their limits. Story 50. My childhood best friend spiraled into heavy drug use. He couldn't hold a steady job, so he started robbing people, including my own family. After a prison sentence, he was released this summer, but clearly nothing changed. About a month ago, he was arrested for identity theft and possession. Disturbingly, he gave police my name and my current address, despite the fact I moved while he was still locked up. That unsettled me, especially since he had been caught lurking near our old house. Not long after, police charged him with the murder of a man who'd been found strangled in his home months earlier. While I always knew he'd fallen into crime, I never thought he'd be capable of murder. They haven't convicted him yet, but the evidence seems strong. Story 51. There were always signs with this guy. He was constantly angry, though I never imagined he'd kill someone. He worked as the receptionist at my job, which was ironic because he was rude, passive-aggressive, and avoided his duties. I'd even started doing his tasks myself just to avoid dealing with him. One day, he suddenly wasn't at work, and we found out he'd been arrested for shooting his ex-boyfriend. He claimed it was self-defense, but the jury didn't believe him. This happened back in 2006, and I recently discovered he's up for parole in 2023. Honestly, it still baffles me how he ever got hired for such a public-facing job in the first place. Story 52 ate first. He didn't strike me as creepy. He was on my late-night fast food crew, laughed at the same off-color jokes as everyone else, and smoked weed after shifts. Later, my cousin, technically my mom's old best friend's daughter, but we always called them family, married him after she got pregnant. When she was pregnant with their second child, tragedy struck. Their house burned down, and everyone assumed it was her ex. She'd actually been living with her twin sister and her husband for safety. But while my cousin was in the hospital giving birth, her husband left with their first child, went back to the house, and murdered the twin sister. Then he calmly returned to the hospital, acting like nothing had happened. It's been 8 years, and it still chills me to think I once spent time with him without realizing who he really was. Story 53. There was a kid at my school who was outright cruel. He harassed the kindest teacher I ever had, constantly skipped class, and frequently got suspended. Years later, he murdered and dismembered someone, scattering the remains in a field. Another kid I rode the bus with once beat up a homeless man for no reason. He eventually shot and killed his pregnant girlfriend. Both of them were pure evil, people who absolutely deserve life sentences. Story 54I grew up in a small town with a boy who later set fire to a neighbor's house, killing 4 people, including 2 children, when he was just 14. Even as a kid, he was marked as bad. I remember being shocked in 3rd grade when he got caught skipping school, something none of us would have dared to do. By middle school, he was smoking, drinking, and using drugs. The night of the fire, he had been caught teaching one of the kids how to use matches. Later, he broke in and torched the house. I actually knew the family well and had even babysat their kids. It was devastating. He was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without parole, the youngest in our state ever tried as an adult. Story 55I once employed a big guy, about 6'5", 250 lbs, who seemed nice enough but had a toxic girlfriend who completely controlled him. She was so disruptive that we banned her from the property. One Friday, he missed payroll cutoff and wasn't allowed to fax his paperwork in, which set him off. He stormed into the office and started attacking staff, even throwing me across the room when I tried to intervene. We pressed charges. Months later, the paper called, not about the assault, but because he had murdered his ex's new boyfriend, decapitated him, and driven off to Utah like nothing happened. He was eventually caught at a truck stop, waiting for his next trucking job. Story 56 for me. It hit after the fact. My ex-husband swept me off my feet with this over-the-top romance. Once we moved in together, though, he started isolating me from family and friends. He became forceful in bed, sometimes terrifyingly so, and obsessed with violent fantasies. He even described torturing people in a basement business he imagined starting with his brother. He once told me about working in a mental hospital where he slammed a patient to the ground, killing him. It had been ruled an accident, but he admitted to me it was his first murder, and he described it with disturbing joy. I eventually got out, but to this day, I still shiver at how casually he confessed those things. Story 57. The closest I know is an attempted murderer. She was a grad student who once taught one of my classes, and we'd grabbed lunch a couple of times. After graduation, she got a university job and became obsessed with a coworker. Eventually, she tried one of those love me or die situations. It shocked me, though maybe I should have seen it coming. She once mentioned her favorite artist was MMORPG gore music. I thought it was a joke. Clearly it wasn't. So many of these stories share a disturbing theme. People often didn't notice any warning signs, or they dismissed odd behavior as harmless. And like that psychiatrist once said, maybe murderers aren't some alien breed at all. They're just like the rest of us, except one day they stop holding back their darkest impulses.